Welcome to ITE Canada Career Connect with Kate. My name is Kate Whitfield and I'm a principal with Alta Planning and Design in Ottawa. The goal of each and every one of these episodes is to help people looking for jobs in Canada in the field of transportation, engineering, and planning. The theme of this episode is co-op programs in Canada. So we're talking about post-secondary institutions with a formal program for students to have job placements during their education. And we'll get into that in a second. These placements can be 4 months to a year or even 16 months, as far as I understand. So as we get into the conversation, we're going to talk about what makes a good co-op program, maybe advice for companies, municipalities on approaches to hiring people through them. What is a successful experience for all involved? Maybe even tips on good job postings. So with that in mind, I went a different route for the guests. No one here is currently looking for employment today. Rather, they're here to share ideas on the topic. So the first guest, an obvious choice, Sean Nix, Associate Dean at Sheridan College. I'll let you do the rest of your intro, Sean, but someone, in my life through other organizations, TAC, ITE, LinkedIn, someone who's helped a ton of people get work. There's no doubt about that. So Sean, I'll pass it to you for sort of a 2-minute introduction.
Sure. So thank you very much, Kate. So I currently find myself as Associate Dean of Architectural Technology and Chemical and Environmental Sciences at Sheridan College Oversight with Brampton and Mississauga campuses. This probably marks the first time in my career that I have no oversight or affiliation with transportation. I sincerely hope that that's a temporary situation. I do hope to eventually bring some transportation programming here. I've spent the last 10 years in post-secondary education in the roles of faculty and also as Associate Dean at another institution. And with that, some oversight over and assistance with co-op programs ranging from 8 to 16 months.
Great. And then another guest is Ben. So Ben, I'll let you describe yourself, but you were sort of suggested as someone that's been highly involved with, I guess, the UBC, ITE Canada chapter, and other sort of initiatives through ITE. And I was told, call Ben, get him to come. So thank you. But why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you for the invitation. Super happy to be here today. My name is Ben Corbett. I'm a 4th-year civil engineering student at the University of British Columbia. I've been, as you said, Kate, heavily involved in ITE for the past few years as previous president of the UBC ITE student chapter. Was also involved in organizing our Student Leadership Summit at the national level last summer with the conference. Professionally, I'm currently working as a student transportation planner at Translink, which is Metro Vancouver's transportation authority. We provide public transit service to our region of 2.5 million people, and my role is to make sure that the service is where it needs to be. With ridership coming back from after COVID, we're seeing crowding in different areas of the system, and I'm part of the team that is managing that to make sure we provide the best experience for our customers.
That's really great. So our third guest is Kassidee. So we're meeting for the first time right now. Kassidee responded to some of my LinkedIn post about this topic when I was writing about it and showed sort of enthusiasm for the subject. So I said, hey, why don't you come and talk about it here? So I'll let you introduce yourself, Kassidee.
Awesome. And thanks, Kate. It's nice to meet you and our other guests here today. My name is Kassidee Fior. I'm currently the manager of development planning at the district municipality of Muskoka here in Ontario. So regional government, primarily looking after things like subdivisions, condominiums. We also do some lower tier approvals like OPAs. But really, I fell into planning in sort of an unconventional way. I actually started as a summer student with sort of a planning specific background. And that program really influenced sort of the trajectory of my career and where I ended up. And I took part in that for a number of years, sort of as a summer co-op student. And then I also did an internship in my master's. So I'm pretty familiar with a variety of ways that those programs are led. And it's something that I definitely want to start instituting in my current role and seeing if we can get sort of, younger involvement in the profession. So really excited to be here today.
It's really great. And there's so many parts that we could cover here, right? There's why a company or a municipality would use a co-op program, how it might benefit a student, but also the mechanics. So maybe I'll save the mechanics part of it, because as someone who just tried to hire through co-op, I'm going to sort of talk about the experience as an employer. Also, maybe as someone who reads resumes with co-op jobs on them. But why don't we go over to you, Sean, just sort of a bit more about the co-op structure and a bit of like from the institution perspective?
Sure. So ultimately, what we expect as an institution is that the work experience does lead to the student coming back to the institution once they're done. So notwithstanding how long the duration is, the important step is that the student does come back. And we know that there are a couple of notable, what we'll call grandfathered exceptions at a couple of other institutions, including those that I've competed with. But generally speaking, we want students to come back. So many rotations will differ depending on the institution, but ultimately we tend to see them in 4-month chunks. So it could be a student goes away for 4 months and then comes back and takes an academic semester, goes away again, comes back. And this might allow them to work with different employers, look at different styles. So if it's in a transportation setting, one might work in design, one might work in signals, one might work in planning. Or it might be structured where they're adjacent to each other. So they're able to take 3 consecutive co-op terms and actually do a year-long co-op. And we find that there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So the advantages to the shorter co-ops is that students can sort of by choice and by expectation work for different companies, work for different fields and be able to develop that diverse experience. On the other hand, we recognize for the employers that the training needs of having to retrain somebody every 4 months is very difficult. Doesn't really allow the students to work on very heavy duty projects. So we do have awareness of advantages of both models, and I encourage both wherever I can.
And Sean, do you think now that usually it's someone's in a co-op based education or they choose to do a co-op? So right when you sign up for that degree, are you agreeing to always go off on these, or it's more like I'm in my degree or whatever form of sort of institution, and you're sort of going, okay, actually, I would like to go do a co-op placement. Does my question make sense?
Yes. So some programs are structured where co-op is an inherent part of actually obtaining the credential. So it would be considered mandatory. Even though it's mandatory, somebody can technically reserve the right to withdraw or not participate in co-op, but they're still responsible for paying the associated co-op fees to pay for the interview structure, access to jobs, and things like that. But then there are some programs where it isn't optional, and so therefore it would simply affect the rotation of how they proceed with their academics. So instead of just proceeding to the following semester or getting a summer break, they would go into a co-op as part of their co-op rotation. So we do see both models depending on the institution.
Yeah, and then the logistics, right? Where you live, what are you doing with your life in the next couple of months? I can see that. And I guess the other logistical thing would be the program is administered by the school, so the postings come. So as an employer, it's not like I'm broadcasting, I have a co-op position. I have to go to each institution, post it through them, they collect resumes. So that's also kind of maybe a defining feature of a formal program.
Yeah, so if co-op is a part of the program, whether optional or mandatory, one of the main advantages for the students is that they are not responsible for hunting for their own positions. So it does allow for a funnel of positions to come to one central portal. Students will still apply and compete with each other and interview against each other the same way they would for a real job after graduation. But at least there is that centralized portal, so it does make it easy. That being said, students are welcome to hunt for their own positions and potentially reach out to those who are not participating with the institution directly and try to secure a position, particularly if it's outside of the region. So, if we have students who are visiting from out of province or out of town who want to work closer to where their original hometown is, then they can certainly work with their co-op specialists or co-op staff to be able to help secure that and work the details out with the employer.
Oh, neat. So Ben, do you want to take this chance to tell us sort of firsthand experience as someone through a co-op?
Absolutely. So throughout my degree, I've completed 3 co-op terms with different employers. The first one was a research position at UBC over the summer. The second was a year with Bunton Associates, a transportation engineering consultant in Western Canada. And the third was a municipal engineering position with ISL Engineering. And those positions were all quite different from each other. The one with Bunt was a year long, so I had an opportunity to learn a lot more in depth and really developed a lot of technical skills through that. Whereas at ISL, I was working on one project for almost the entire time. And that allowed me to dive deeply into that one project, but didn't really see very much of anything else. As a student, I would say that it's really helpful to have that opportunity to get all those different experiences. And the centralized job board does still make quite a bit of a difference. But then one of the things is, you still have to do all of the work to apply to these jobs. So I think some people have the impression that you get into co-op and you have a guaranteed job, but it is still quite a lot of work to do the job search, at least at UBC and in my case.
Oh, there's a lot of good. So both the structure is there to give you those chances, but obviously, yeah, you have to get them. That's a whole question of how competitive it is within a school. I'm super curious about that. And then also, I guess, some municipal experience, some private would be, I'm guessing, what people would try for maybe to see their interest. But I guess there's so many variables. Also, probably how early the posting's up and wanting to know where you're moving to or not moving.
The length of posting is a really big one too. There's a lot of students that have only 4 months in the term and they have to go back to classes, but the posting they want requires it to be 8 months.
Oh, that's a good point. So Kassidee, I know your district of Muskoka doesn't have a formal program to use co-op students, but I love that you jumped in on LinkedIn. So do you want to just share some thoughts as someone working in the field of planning and sort of this job experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing I will say is that in a previous role, actually sort of that did transition, almost like Ben mentioned, from something that was a 4-month internship. It wasn't called a co-op, but it was very similar. It was required for my school program. That did lead into sort of, part-time employment during the school year as well, which was nice. It did kind of require a fine line in terms of balance, but I would say that, from a municipal perspective, co-op students are phenomenal. Same with summer students. They really do add a lot of value, a lot of new ideas coming in and a lot of new blood. It's just really refreshing to have them around when we do have them. So I think it's a really valuable sort of position to have. I think there are some challenges associated with that 4-month time frame. I think, as we previously discussed, just around, what type of projects you can work on and how deep you can go into them, because it seems as though when you start them, you're already winding down, trying to prepare to transition that knowledge to someone else. So it is kind of a challenging sort of length of time to work with, but I think it also allows for a lot of collaboration and a lot of different sort of team work, not so much in working with the same team consistently, but just overall, demonstrating how to transition to another person and sort of have your work wrapped up with a nice bow to show what you've done. I think that's really, from a municipal perspective, the challenges associated with it, but I think they're incredibly valuable in our world. And, especially when people come to us with having a variety of experiences, it's great.
That's really neat. So as a private sector business that decided to have our first in Canada co-op for engineering, I'm like, okay, great, we're going to do this. We're going to put up ads. I found it interesting because we looked at length of position, because we have a separate internship that's short. So we'll do this for a year. So we went and looked around for schools that had a year. I admit that's the first thing we looked. And then it was, I'm curious if firms go for multiple schools or just get one that they're used to. I'm really curious about that, because we tried to be open and to different ones, but some schools gave us 0 applicants or some person in robotics, right? So it's not really a match. So then you kind of, is that worth it for the filing of the paperwork to support more schools? But that's coming from a rookie at this, right? But it was still an experience, I'll admit, when we opened the folder and there's nobody in it. Okay, well, that wasn't really worth it to post it there. So it may be our fault. We shouldn't have gone to a school that doesn't have a transportation, but still we were experimenting with how it works. So I don't know, Sean, do you want to take logistics of that kind of angle of the user from the employer side? Or whatever you want, really.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the comment that came to mind, all you have to do is watch an episode of Suits, where a company targets a particular school. They always wanted the Harvard graduate to practice law, and then they would only recruit from Harvard and never been that role. And I'm fully aware of firms that will do exactly that, depending on the type of practice that they're doing, whether it's civil engineering, whether it's urban planning, whether it's whatever. They'll always go to the particular target school. And so certain institutions kind of, accept that and move on. There's a diverse pool of employers that can participate, but one of the things that we can do as programs, depending on whatever institution we're working at, whatever field we're working at, is to try to break down those barriers and really try to highlight the advantages of going diverse and not always recruiting from the same institution, not always looking at the same practices. Again, we recognize that the year-long is very attractive from a labor perspective, from a training perspective. But we also have to remember that co-op is really intended to be a learning experience for the students, and we really don't want to take away from that. So part of the learning experience is working with diverse employers, working in different areas of the sector. And so while we recognize that the year-long experience can also be a bit of a two-way benefit, it's great for students to work at the same location and work on very, very exciting projects. There can be disadvantages to that in that they don't necessarily get the perspective of what working with different employers and different practices can be. So really, that's just the word of encouragement to employers, is to try to have a little bit of diverse opinions on and maybe experiment with a little bit of both. What I am aware of is that certain schools only post for co-op positions during the summer, which is a little bit different when you need year-round coverage. So some institutions will have rotations where somebody's working in the fall, another group is working in the winter, another group's working summer, and some will only have during the summer. So, being aware of those particular challenges or limitations can also be useful as well.
And I would agree. I think it's generally better for employers to try to recruit from multiple schools. One of the reasons is because the schools, like one school in particular, might not have very many candidates with a certain skill at a certain point in time. But also different institutions provide different training for the students that are there. And I think one thing that companies that I've worked for have found is the school that they recruit from actually has a really big impact on the skills that their co-op student brings into the firm. And it can be interesting to have that diversity of skills and experiences throughout successive co-ops.
And I think if I could jump in as well, the one thing I would say, coming from a more academic perspective and less from my current role, is when I was at Queen's doing my master's, we were heavily involved in the sort of internship program. And the thing that really made the biggest difference in terms of who you got as an applicant seemed to be the relationship between the person looking for that co-op student and the person running the co-op or internship sort of role. So that facilitator really, reached out to their connections. And so I think most of the time there was some sort of at least indirect connection, if not a direct connection, between the employer looking for a co-op student and the person who runs that program at that school. So I think, a lot of it is building that connection and sort of, continuously saying, hey, I'm interested in hiring someone. Do you have someone who might fit, even if they're not in a specific program?
That's an interesting example. So Kassidee, we're both Queen's planning grads. Okay. So so Queen's was a 2-year master's, and you were encouraged to get a job in the middle of the year, but you didn't have to do it to get your piece of paper at the end. And they helped you get jobs, but you could go get your own for sure. And your thing about connections, I went back to Fredericton, which was where I went to university. I mean, that was probably more than just a job posting. That was probably a connection of mine because I had gone to school there. So I see that. That's neat though. But is that an internship? Is it a co-op? But I get it. I get what, and it was a big part of my education. My master's was that middle summer because it was real world experience. And certainly, we talked about finding a project. I think I had to do something like source a tent and do a sign bylaw. So there's a 4-month job. Well, this is really great. And then the other one would be reading resumes with co-ops. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you get a resume with a few companies, especially private sector, seeing a resume with a bunch of private sector. It does not hurt for someone to be noticed. There's no doubt about that. But it's understood that's through a co-op program, right? Like that gave that advantage to that student. No, it's really neat. Is there anything else that someone wants to share sort of on the world of what makes a placement successful? So even communicating what the expectations of the job is that they're coming to, I guess that's also something.
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed throughout my experience is the private companies that I've worked for have tended to see co-ops as pretty much just another junior employee. And once they've demonstrated a certain level of ability to complete tasks, they're essentially just a younger, EIT level role, basically. Whereas at the current role that I'm at in Translink, there's a very defined set of tasks for the student planner. The student planner is responsible for this and this and this and this. And it's interesting how those two approaches differ. I think in terms of technical skills, I probably learned quite a bit more by having that more flexible role. But I've also learned a lot in managing a specific set of responsibilities as well.
And I think I completely agree with Ben. I would say, in my personal experience from an employment in sort of the pseudo co-op realm, I really enjoyed having that structured student specific co-op role where it was really clear, these are the goals of your, we recognize it's a short length of time. This is what we want to see you be able to do by the end of it. This is, how that's going to happen. And they tended to be a little bit better on the training side. So they really had specific training programs that were, adapted to that length of time. Whereas I find sort of the more flexible one tends to be almost a little bit more disorganized, which does allow for a lot of, initiative and sort of, make it your own, which is also really great. But I find, especially for the first instance, it can be really challenging if someone hasn't been in a similar role or in that profession before to be able to really get enough out of it compared to if it was more structured. Once you have a little bit more experience, it's way easier to adapt to that. But I think it makes a huge difference at the beginning.
And I think from the educator's side of things, my perspective would be that whether it's heavily structured or whether or not it's very loosely structured, at the very least, some form of learning be built into that 4 months or 8 months or however long it might be. And so that means any form of targeted awareness building for the student about the industry, about the company's culture, about the agency's culture, about dealing with the public, and anything like that. So that could be something as simple as inviting students to meetings, whether they're supposed to be there, not just to at least be able to observe, taking them out into the field, introducing them to senior members of the agency or department or whatnot, just to become aware of the structure of the employer, and all sorts of things in between, right? But as long as some form of learning is built in, so that they're not strictly built, as Ben would allude to, as another junior employee who's navigating their way through the employer.
Yeah, so this is really, so the thoughtfulness of how the intern will be, and co-op would be supported, as opposed to here's a desk and there's a computer down the hall. Good luck. No, that's really helpful. Listening though, I can think of two things. One, just Sean about engineer, and then another type of co-op in engineering. It's like an engineering degree and you'll go get your EIT. But a planning co-op, you're opening the door to a ton of different education, right? Which is wonderful, but that's also would change maybe where you post because it's quite broad. That's a whole other sort of subject of how many places you post and how you communicate what the job is too. Like the words in your ad of what you'd be doing each day, I think is another thing.
Yeah, and admittedly, I don't have as much experience with the planning co-ops as I do with the engineering co-ops. I've been paying attention to some of the postings, both directly with my own institution or just in passing when I'm looking at whatever is available on LinkedIn, just to kind of see where the employment market is at the time. But you're right. Again, it can, the field of planning in particular is very broad, and that you could be focusing in all sorts of different areas, whether it's heritage, whether it's design, whether it's development review. You name it. But so having the diverse options can certainly open up a lot of doors for people who participate in multiple. And as far as I know, most of the planning programs do have the shorter terms over a series of successive co-op terms. the one that I set up at my last institution was a 12-month intensive, and part of that was because no one else was doing it that way. So we figured we'd at least try it that way just to see if we could test the employment market a little bit and be a little bit more competitive that way. But yeah.
Our recent experience with a planning co-op was schools worried that it was long enough to count for the credit. So that was an interesting one, that the job couldn't be 3 months, it had to be 4, because then they wouldn't get the credit, which is fine, but that was still valuable information. So Ben, I'm going to come to you, but I'm just going to do one thing. I'm going to let you three think about sort of your top thing that you wanted to communicate today about co-op. Well, I just do one little other little story and maybe tie that into a question too. The other one is remote work. So in our thought, we have a lot of flexibility of hybrid, but we think that the co-op or an intern should have a high level of in-person, because otherwise they're only with me in these meetings with something else. There's no banter, there's no overhearing a conversation, there's no, hey, let's just talk about that. Everything would have to be structured. And I personally, even though I want hybrid and flexibility, you're losing a lot of just hearing how people project manage, hearing how proposals are written, even overhearing phone calls about any subject. So one is a top tip, and two is if you have any extra commentary on sort of remote in person. So Ben, we'll go to you next because you had wanted to share something.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said. I do definitely see the advantages of flexible work, and that it can be really helpful for everyone, including co-op students. But the experiences that I learned from the most were just from the other people in the office and seeing how they handled problems when they went and talked to people, or just being able to throw a question out and get an answer right away. My top piece of advice for the co-op student is try to learn as many different things as you can. Try to surround yourself with different people and learn different skills, because that will be really helpful later. And I found, for example, in my second co-op where I was doing design, whereas my first co-op I was doing planning, having that sort of planning knowledge helped me be more critical of what we were being asked to design and try to understand it better. And I'm sure there's lots of other examples that people might have where, you take one learning from a previous co-op or placement and you use that further along in your career.
That's great. Sean?
I wanted to get back to your hybrid or work from home situation, because one of the advantages of being in an educational institution is I sit on a number of what we call program advisory committees, where we actually have members of industry serving multiple programs coming together at least once or twice a year to talk about what the program is looking for and perhaps what co-op employers are looking for. And we have heard in the last 2 years, in particular, especially with the effects of the pandemic, that nowadays the employers are really trying to make a targeted effort having some sort of minimal presence requirement for students to come into the office, purely to build in that office culture as part of the learning experience. Learn what it is like to work in an office as opposed to constantly being at home or at school all the time, just to ensure that students are aware of that. The flip side to that, though, unfortunately, especially in this employee market right now, because it really is what we'll call a buyer's market right now for students looking for work, is that there are more jobs than students right now. And so now students are in a bit of a game where they'll accept an offer, and loyalty is no longer even a thing anymore. Students will accept an offer, and then they'll start to use that as the carrot to the next person to say, what are you going to offer me that's a little bit better? Do I get 4 days at home as opposed to 3 days at home? Are you going to offer me $1 more an hour? And we're seeing that this is happening. And the employers are incredibly frustrated by this type of activity. So got to find that fine balance, because students are now on the hunt and they know that they're in a little bit of control right now. So it's a bit of a wild thing. One tip I'll throw in just to close this up is more towards the employers. Because many of these students are going back to school, one of the things that they're going to be looking for and probably going to be asking you at some point is for a topic or at least some intensive amounts of data to support a capstone project. So one of the things that, they'll be working on projects for you as an employer, but they'll also want to be able to take something back to their institution in the form of a capstone project. So please be ready to help them with perhaps finding or helping to scope out a viable topic and then being able to support them with any data or any other needs that you might be able to help them with.
Oh, that's fantastic. So Kassidee?
Yeah, and I think to build on what Sean said, I think, bonus points if something that they're actively working on during their term with you can actually be used for that capstone project, because it makes a huge difference in terms of getting a little bit of a head start, like if that's eligible and as part of the program, and you have those connections already. So it kind of, cuts out the cold calling part and some of those random requests for data that I'm sure we all get or need. And so it really is helpful. I would say from my one tip from an employer perspective is just be really clear about what you're looking for. The one piece that I found really detrimental as someone seeking out sort of that shorter term employment was when it was a very generic job posting and you don't really know what it's for. And that makes it really hard if you're seeking out your own opportunities and it's not, a communal job posting, or maybe it is at the school and you're still kind of like, what even is this job? It's really hard to tell if it's a generic fit. So just be cognizant of whether your business or your company or your municipality has standard wording that really doesn't work for a student position. Like, they're students, you have to recognize that. From a student perspective or a co-op position perspective, I would say take the opportunity to realize that this is like one of the best chances to learn, as Ben put, sort of everything from the ground up, and no one's going to judge you for it. Like, it gives you a lot of time to learn the basics of an organization. You can read all the background policies, you can ask for additional materials to read and look at, and you can build a really interesting foundation to build on throughout the rest of your career, whether you stay there or move on, but you have all of that knowledge that you've then absorbed. And, no one's going to say, well, you're not doing enough work because, you're a co-op student. Like, they recognize you that you're there to learn. As to the hybrid thing, I think, personally, I've discovered that I teach and I learn best in person. So that's something that I would definitely recommend. Is there opportunities to build in hybrid in some form, so at least there's a little bit of flexibility? Absolutely. I think, everybody has their preferred method of sitting at home and writing a report, or, being in the office surrounded by people. But I think at the very least, there has to be a pretty significant component of being together in person, whether it's reading through documents or just hearing the office chatter.
Wow, this is great. Yeah, thank you for today. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I hope it's just a sampling, right, of something that's already a great system, right? And we can only use it properly and better, right? And expand it. And keep sharing the stories. So thank you very much. And just as usual, when people post topics on the ITE Canada feed or to me on LinkedIn, we'll just keep finding the right people to have the conversation together and then see where it goes from there. So thank you for today. I love it. So Sean, really, like I knew that before people would accept a job and then back out. So that's always been there, but like negotiate and like
it's become incredible. So we found that the civils in particular were really struggling. Here's the very, very formal student structure for a co-op position. They're like, yeah, and then literally like a week later they quit for $1 more an hour or something, and it's happening. And so automatically a student will fail the co-op term on the transcript, but they'll still get paid out from the next company and still be able to log the experience. So it's trade-offs now.
Yeah, but what's interesting is probably the school gets blamed a little bit. Like,
yeah. So there's a lot of blowback on the school for sure. Right?
Yeah. And then also, if there was like 10 really good people, I would have just taken the other. Like, the other person wanted the
Except
job.
that then that person's already gone because they've accepted an offer somewhere else.
Yeah.
It's
Anyway,
crazy right now. Yeah.
Because one benefit of co-op is there's sort of a price to it. So it's not a free market, like a new grad fighting me over their salary. It's sort of like, this is what the school said. So it's not, we're shortchanging you, but this is what we assume is appropriate. Does that make sense?
So,
Instead of someone.
Yeah, but I think there is a little bit of freedom on the part of the agency or the employer, I guess, to set that rate. So you'll get sort of here's the range from the school in terms of what we've ever had. And then you're kind of free to set that. Most of the public agencies will have a set rate because it's a unionized environment, so they've got their collective agreements to satisfy. Private sector is probably in the driver's seat on that one. So
yeah, and I'm just going to add to Sean's point on that. The biggest challenge is the fact that they are not flexible in their pay scale at all, and so they are automatically going to lose in any competition when they try, because like they don't have the time off, they don't have like the money, like it's just one of those, and they have to be in the office. So it's like, what is the appeal unless you know that's what you want to do? It's challenging.
So we've been surprised in the public sector compared to some of the privates that they sometimes come out on top as well.
Really?
So, yeah. It's been an interesting cross section of
especially for very junior staff. The public sector can often pay better.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
we
post
hate
co-op,
that.
yes, for sure. Yeah.
But even out of school, I get so many people that have been at a municipality for a year and they want to come to private and they want 20, 30,000 more. And we're like, we did not pay, cities will not pay us enough to pay you that much. And you'd make more, but we'll pay more later. But it really burns us when we have to go after municipal
I've
stuff.
reminded students of that trade-off. It's like, yeah, you definitely get more upfront, but you're going to get siloed very quickly and you're going to get pretty stale very quickly if that's the attitude that you're going in with. So you kind of want to make it what you will. Right? Sometimes it's an investment to take a little bit less upfront, take a pay cut potentially if it means that you're going to work on some very, very cool projects.
And I think, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe like the one thing I wish that I had been able to experience was like, I think mine were very much like, I happened to fall into public sector jobs and that was great. But I wasn't almost like, because I didn't have a formal co-op or like multiple of them, I didn't get the chance to explore private. And so I think I automatically went to public because that's what I knew and the system I knew. And I could buy back my pension and all this stuff. Whereas, but it's like, I think it's like that thing where, but all of my friends who did a private internship, almost all of them ended up in the private sector. So I think it's like one of those where it would almost be nice if you had to try both in a very low risk way to understand which you like best.
That was definitely one of my goals. I really wanted to try both, and I'm really glad that I have that opportunity.
And in an interview, Ben, though, I would say to you, so what do you think? What's the difference between the two? I would be asking you. That's what I do to people. So you've had both. What do you think? You don't have to answer now. I just mean like, I try to find out if people could pick up on the differences because I think, yeah.
It's one thing to say you've got that experience, but what tangible lessons have you actually taken from the experience?
The one thing I remind all my students is it's a great way to find out who you want to work for. It's also a great way to learn who you don't want to work for. So, if you really had a bad experience, the good thing is you got a light at the end of the tunnel at the end of that 4-month period. You can choose not to apply for them when they're the only ones in the market potentially posting for a position when you're ready. But,